We are here at the Gagosian Gallery on West 24th Street in the exhibition Helen Frankenthaler, Drawing Within Nature, Paintings of the 1990s. And the exhibition includes 12 canvases and 2 large works on paper, all of which are done between 1990 and 1995.
So, John, can you tell us about where Helen Frankenthaler was, both in the world and in her career during this period between 1990 and 1995?
Well, in terms of where she was geographically, she was dividing her time between studios in New York and in Connecticut, and taking trips, including notably to Santa Fe, where she did painting as well. This period immediately follows large third retrospective, which had opened in the 1989.
The material in this show all comes after the 1989 big retrospective and your book, and I'm wondering if you see any kind of big difference or shift or awareness on her part of that as a kind of watershed moment.
Well, I think when artists have retrospectives, they are useful not only for the public but also for the artist. And I think looking back in Helen's career, one realizes, I think, that her 1960 exhibition at the Jewish Museum, which was her first retrospective, really mobilized her to change and push ahead and feel, she'd done this, now what's she going to do next? And I think this one had the same impact throughout her career. There's been moments where she did rely upon certain things which became habitual. In the 60s, she started to put little red dots in different places to define space, rather like Corot had done in his landscapes. And I think eventually she realized that this was a habit which she had to break and keep moving by not allowing herself to be self-imitation, and feeling that the great danger of any development is when an artist becomes self-imitative, even within a relatively short period like the year and a bit represented by this exhibition. You see that she's going to do things in different ways on different canvases, and there are certain canvases which particularly speak to each other, but they're different to other ones which speak to each other.
Right.
And I think that in that way, it's really quite an extraordinary achievement. And when you look through artists who thought to form the canon of modernist painting, you wonder who else has done it quite like this.
I can't think of anyone whose version of abstraction is more expansive, more sort of risk-taking, more sort of willing to court mistakes but learn from them, to try out as what sort of jumps off the canvas to me in these paintings is the use of anything and everything to hand. Rakes that she drags her fingers, the sole of a shoe, and the hot ice painting, which clearly shows that she's working on the floor, but not only that, walking onto her canvas, using her whole body. Sponges. It's so diverse an approach to gesture and to space and to texture.
One thing which I'd not thought about before really seeing all these installed together is the overall relationship to landscape. Seeing the verticals in the exhibition made me think that while they do have a landscape association, we know that traditionally vertical pictures are portraits, horizontal paintings are landscapes. So should we be thinking of these particularly with the kind of materiality they have as being thought of in terms of not a representation of bodies, but of an awareness of the epidermis of the body as these paintings are being made.
I mean, they're in some of the, particularly, as you say, the horizontals, because of their association as a format with landscape, one can see horizons, and sometimes that's reinforced by the title that's given to the work I think always after the fact. But I think the association with the things we think of as landscape is much sort of broader and less literal than that. Which is to say, I think there's sometimes a sense of a kind of geological buildup, kind of stacking of marks and buildup of paint. Sometimes there's a sense of atmosphere and of airiness. Basically the different states of matter, also liquid, obviously. So I think the sort of landscapiness is part of the materiality of the work, and not just a sort of optical or representational illusion. These are paintings, many of which call to mind for me a kind of Monet effect more than perhaps in her earlier work. The reason I think of Monet in part is not just because of the opticality of Monet paintings, but their tactile sort of lapidary buildup, which sometimes seems to contradict the effect of instantaneity, which I think is part of the contradiction of her, of particularly this work too.
Yeah, and we know that she, did admire particularly the late Monets, the bridge paintings, and some of these which are, the particularly crusted ones.
So, I mean, thinking about her earlier work, there's this much more emphasis, I think, on the soak stain technique, but there's also a lot of what she called drawing of color, a lot of gestural marks, a lot of sort of graphisms. They're sort of punctuating a much more material attention to paint in this work.
She's like developing like a whole kind of catalogue of different kinds of ways of applying the paint and seeing how many different ones she can put into one painting.
I think also of Poseidon. I mean, one of the things that's different, to my eye anyway, about this work is that they tend to be pigmented or tinted, stained edge to edge, rather than leaving areas of bare canvas. But in addition to that, like with Poseidon, you have this kind of what looks like a sort of the liquidity of paint, determining the shapes that emerge, particularly with the sort of aqua color. But then you have a swipe of orange with what looks like either a sponge or a house painter's brush or something like that.
Well, I think in that painting, you could imagine that big swathe seems to be almost like the last thing she did.
Yeah.
And before then, it was obviously a very beautiful painting. So imagine, she's risking the whole painting by doing that.
But it makes it. She had a great way with words.
Yes, yeah.
So which also sort of for me connects to her interest in titles, and there's a sort of literary imagination, which also kind of runs contrary to certain purist impulses earlier in the story of American abstraction. Talking to Maureen and Vincent, her longtime studio assistants, she apparently had a kind of notepad or a list of titles that she kept adding to or asking people to add to, that she would make reference to at the end of painting, which means that applying the title was like the signature. Okay, it's done, and now I'm passing it on to the viewer, and I'm encouraging a kind of open-ended play. I mean, in this exhibition we have Hot Ice, which also refers to a kind of kids experiment, but the opposites of hotness and ice. She seemed to be attracted to plays of opposites.
Well, including called A Rake's Progress.
And it has you sort of shuttle between an external reference and the process of by which the painting is made. It's great.
So I think Western Roadmark obviously has its source in Santa Fe, but it doesn't mean it stays in Santa Fe. I mean, it's obviously a generalized version, but one can understand that bright sunset, and also those clouds, which actually are presumably gel, which, I mean, they have a strange effect of actually, when you look away, you always feel that they're moving along the picture.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about the Western road map, since its colorism does sort of evoke, and the storminess of the purple upper register does seem to evoke a kind of Western palette. Yeah, it does do what you're suggesting. It kind of makes it move. It's interesting because the gel is perhaps the most extreme version of what I see going on in a lot of work from this period, is the kind of thicker buildup, the impasto, the texturing, the desire almost for a kind of sculptural effect to the paint, as opposed to, or in relation to, a kind of sinking in stain-like effect, which she also gets with particular force in the paper works. Yeah. So there seems to be a kind of oscillation between.
And both things at once.
Yeah.
And I think it is part of that fascination of some of these that, and I think Western Road Mac very much so, that two kinds of picture making have come together.
Yeah.
We know that she was particularly fond of this, and particularly in the latter years when she was suffering and she spent a lot of time in her apartment in New York. This was the painting she had on the wall.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So it was a kind of
okay.
memory of an open landscape in a way.
Yeah, memory of a landscape which she liked, and I think a memory of different kinds of paintings that she had done with that.
Stella Polaris is probably the one that I would take home if I could. But the sort of cobalt blue of it is to me just flat out gorgeous. And then I love the variety of mark making there, the kind of row of splotches down at the bottom and the variety of different marks. And then giving it the title Stella Polaris both is a kind of icing on the cake, and it makes me then associate it with sort of constellations. But it's a loose association, not a literal one, and it means that you can toggle back and forth between being immersed in the process and the color sensation and the kind of poetic or extra pictorial associations that also come to bear.
The Rake's Progress, it's almost like despite the title, that's what I really enjoy about this painting is the extraordinary difference of seeing it close up as far from looking at the picture. We know that Baudelaire wrote about some of Delacroix's paintings that when you look at them from a distance where you can hardly imagine what the subject is, you are nevertheless captivated by this amazing sense of a sort of coloured mist which is floating in front of the surface of the picture. And in a way it's a bit similar to when you look at that picture across the room. It seems like this sort of extraordinarily loose, fluid, beautiful thing, which as you moves into materiality,
right.
And in a way it's like bringing it down to earth.
I'm wondering if we should talk a tiny bit more about the paper works, which really stand out. I mean, it seemed to me that the paper support was very important to her. But if one can feel, for instance, that she's working at tabletop level rather than at floor level, or if her increased activity in printmaking had an effect.
She was obviously doing a lot of this in this last period, which is obviously where all the decisions will be being made at tabletop level. I mean, I think the other thing which is very noticeably different is not only the thinness of the surface, but the fact that it's been put on paper rather than canvas, and therefore the paint slicks more. No bite of a canvas to slow down the movement of the paint, so that you have the sense of a continuous pool of colour running across them. And I think she enjoyed, as she was doing more and more painterly paintings, to be able to have this other kind of practice to be continuing.
But it's interesting in the particularly flirt and airy, the texture of the paper really matters, almost more than for me than the canvas matters in these works. There's a kind of push and pull between the toothy texture of the paper and the wetness of the paint.
Yeah, you can see the paper all the way through, you're not aware of it.